Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the procedural park. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the general settings for your park. So these are going to be things like the auto parameters, the batch details. We're going to be taking a look at the trace details for troubleshooting and how to move the inner volume to adjust your central actors. So if we go back to Unreal, if you did not take a look at the quick guide, make sure that you are in the level tutorial. So go to Procedural Park, Maps, Level Tutorial, and when you open it, make sure that you drag your park. So go to Blueprints, Tools, BP Park, and you can just drag it here. And that way you'll be exactly where I am. This level has been pre-made for all of the tutorials, and it basically comes with a landscape with the material already there, a post-process, and just the lights, right? So when you have your park selected, you're going to have a section called Setup General, and this is what we're going to be talking about in this video. So you have two bounce scales here. The bounce scale value here, which is 200 by 200 in this case, which defines the actual size of your park. You can actually change the values manually, right? So I can make it 300 by 500, for example. Or I can make it whatever I want, right? 100 by 500. So if you want a park that's really skinny, for example, in one direction, maybe you're putting this in your city, you can do that as well easily. You also have the inner volume here, which is the second settings here, and you can adjust the size manually again. So you can make this 200 by 200, for example, or whatever value you want. Now, the outer volume here is the actual size of the park, while the inner volume here will determine the area where the central actors can spawn. Remember, the central actors are basically where all of the paths kind of converge together, right? And you want to make sure that this area is near the center of the park so the pathways have enough space to go from the outer limits all the way to the inside. However, notice that if I zoom back in here a little bit more, there's a little blue icon that says inner volume location. And you can actually click here. You notice that the mouse changes. And now when I have that selected, I'm going to zoom out here. I can actually use the little arrows here to move my volume to a specific location. See that? And that basically gives you flexibility to spawn your actors anywhere you want. So this means that you don't necessarily have to have all your central actors always in the exact middle of the park. As you can see here, they spawned in this little corner, and if I create the pathways, then the pathways create this way, right? So from this end, your pathways are way longer, and from this end, your pathways are very short. So you have the ability to control where your central actors spawn. And another cool thing here is that you can use this for several things, right? So if I change this to 150 to 150, for example, what I can do, and I'm going to go ahead and set parameters here for massive park. I'm going to specifically go back to setup generation, central actor details, and total actors are 9. I'm going to change this to like 4 for demonstration purposes. And if I come back here and say spawn central actors, notice that we spawned 4 actors in this area, but now I can actually move this to another area of my park and click on spawn central actors again. Now I have 8, right? The recommended number was 9, but instead of spawning all 9 in one area, what I've done is I specifically distributed the elements to this area here and now this area here. So if I click on create paths, now you have a more interesting design where you have some density here of actors, and then you have some density here with areas here that are going to be empty, and you can put your props here. So that's the reason why I allow you to move the inner volume here. Now make sure that you keep it inside the park, right? If you move the volume outside of the park, you're going to get errors. And if you get very close to the edge here, you're going to mess up the pathways that are in this area. You always want to have a buffer zone that allows the pathways to actually spawn and try to connect with the central actor. So keep in mind that there's like an invisible wall here that doesn't allow you to get too close to the edges. If you follow those rules, you should be fine. And if you go back up here, you'll see that there's a value called inner volume location. If you reset it by clicking on the little arrow here, 000 will make this go back to its original location in the middle. All right, you have a few settings here. Marker visible, this just shows you this little green volume, and this is on by default. Typically I turn it off when I'm working so I can actually see what's going on. But if for some reason you have a lot going on in your level and you need to see this specifically to know exactly where the park begins and ends, you can make it that way. Marker hidden means that if you click play, the volume will disappear. But maybe you want to see it during gameplay for testing purposes, and in that case you can just deselect this, click play, and you'll see that the volume stays there. Typically you don't want to do that, but if for some reason you really want to know exactly where the park is, you can do that as well. This option, show messages, basically means that the park will show you status messages on the left hand corner when it encounters errors or it spawns things. And I would recommend that you leave this on. There's really no reason to turn it off, right? As you're generating your park, you're going to see some important messages here. So for example, if I try to spawn pathways without having central actors and I click create pathways, notice that I get an error that says BP Park, no central actors found, because we need central actors. Or if I decide to spawn foliage and I click spawn foliage, notice that I'm going to know how many trees actually spawn. 359 out of a potential batch of 2082. Right, so you actually know exactly how many trees spawn. If I click on spawn foliage again, this time only 211, and if I click that again, only 18. So you can see there, because the trees are actually going, and every time you spawn, there's going to be more obstacle detection. Sorry. So that's the reason why. Now, the next few things here, the tag list, if you open this, are going to be a list of tags that are used internally by the park to do obstacle avoidance. So no spawn tags pathways, and no spawn tags props pathways are just the internal tags that are used to make sure that things don't spawn on top of each other. I don't recommend you kind of mess with this. This is just there for you to see. If you wanted to add your own tags for your park for whatever reason, you would add them here. But please don't delete any of this. If you do, you're going to see some weird behavior when you're spawning your elements. Then you have your park size preset. This is just a convenient way of resizing your outer and inner volumes. That's really all it is. It just has a specific size that I've determined is what I categorize as a massive park, a huge park, really big park. But remember, you can change the numbers manually, right? So even if you want something bigger than a massive park, which is 500 by 500, you can change it to whatever you want, 800 by 800, for example. So it's up to you to make, to make the size whatever you want. Then you have the parameter presets, which basically mean that based on the size of the park, I automatically calculate an optimal number of entrances, central actors, props, foliage density, and grass and flower density. And again, by default, all of them are medium density except for flowers, which in my opinion, if you want to have a lot of flowers, you want to have the density high. And this just changes the recommended number that is calculated when you click on set parameters. So if you select your park and say, I want my park to be really big, and you click on set parameters, you can see here that the parameters have been set for really big park. And if you go to the setup foliage section, you'll see that the park calculated that the foliage to spawn should be 750. It's aiming to spawn 750 trees. But if I go here to the parameters preset and change the foliage density to high, and I click on set parameters again, that 750 basically doubles to 1500 trees. So what all of this is doing is basically a multiplier based on the number that I've determined is optimal for the size of the park. So if I say I actually don't want my park to have a lot of density, I want it to be very bare, a very low density of trees, you select low, set parameters, and now we'll only spawn 187 trees. So that's really the principle. Now, obviously, you can come here and put whatever number you want, right? 9,100 trees, and it'll just try to pack those trees in as much as possible. But this is simply used as a starting point when you click on set parameters. Now, in my opinion, my recommendation would be to always start with the presets and then tweak from there. I've done a lot of testing and I've determined what I consider to be a very good number for these values here based on the size. And later on, you can go ahead and change them. Park material details. This is typically not as used, but it's more of a nice to have. So the whole point here is that maybe you want your park to have a different material layer than the rest of the landscape. So let's say, for example, that I'm going to go ahead and click on landscape and click on paint. And the material that comes with the park has 4 layers. Procedural, which is the main one. And this is the one that spawns the grass, right? And it will also spawn rock if you have a big slope. You have foliage removal. So if I paint here, you see that it removed the grass meshes, but not the grass texture. Or if I go to path and I click here, it'll actually spawn some dirt. And I can go ahead and click on sand and spawn some sand here. Now, if I wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and select foliage removable and click on shift and paint over to remove that layer. If I wanted to remove that, I can just paint the procedural layer on top and it'll create the grass again. But let's say that you're creating a game in the desert, right? And you want your entire landscape to actually be full of sand. You can actually click on the sand layer, right click, select fill layer, and now your entire your entire level is full of sand. But what if you wanted your park to be like a little oasis, right? Only in your park do you want to have grass. And that's where the park material comes into play. So you can select your landscape. You can select the material layer index of your material in your landscape. In this case, remember we always start from 0. So 0, 1, 2, and 3. So in this case, I want material layer 0, the procedural layer, to be painted in the park. And now with this option selected, I can go down here and set apply park material. And notice now that the park, the entire volume of the park, now has the grass texture. If you want to see the final material, notice that there's no grass that is spawning here, and that's because we have to force Unreal to update the material instance. So click on your landscape, make sure you scroll down here and click on landscape material. You can click here and then open the material instance, and all we need to do is change. You can see I'm disabling and enabling. We want to change a parameter and save it to force Unreal to update the material. And now you can see that the park itself, and only the park, has grass. And now you can go ahead and spawn the rest of the stuff just as you would normally, right? And now your park will have grass, but the rest of your landscape will have something else. All right, so that is the purpose of the park material. All right, I'm going to go ahead and refresh the material. All right, the next is the batch details, and typically you don't need to really mess with this, but the idea here is that if you have a really big park, say that we have a massive park, right, in this case, and we want to set the parameters, and maybe we want our foliage to be very dense, right? So high density for our foliage, and that's going to be 4,100 trees. Depending on the specs of your machine, your editor may lock up, right? If you have a lot of trees that you want to spawn, maybe your editor will just kind of freeze. So what we do is we use this batch size to specify to the park how many actors or hierarchical instance static meshes can it spawn at a time. So in this case, the default is 5,000 actors and 20,000 instant static meshes. That works really well on my machine, but if you have a lower powered machine, maybe this value shouldn't be 5,000, maybe this value should be 1,000. And if you have the value of 1,000 and you're trying to spawn 4,100 trees, what will happen is if you click on spawn foliage, notice that it'll tell you 365 batch 0 to 999. I click again and says batch 1000 to 1999, and you click again and it says batch 2000 to 3000, and eventually batch 3000 to 3999, and you click again and eventually says done. So in other words, instead of trying to spawn 4,100 trees at the same time, it'll break it down and it'll only spawn 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000, right? And again, you may not need this, but in the case of having either a really big park or maybe a lower powered machine, these values will come into play. So that's all it is, right? It's just making sure that your editor doesn't lock up. So I would just not mess with these settings. If you feel like when you're spawning your trees on your grass, your editor starts to lock up, make sure that you lower these values here to prevent that from happening. Then you have the trace details here, and this is again probably not needed for you to mess with it, but the way that the park works is it takes, when you spawn an actor, it takes the bounds of an actor, and that's what it uses to make sure that no actors are overlapping, right? So if the bounds of your tree are 200 by 200, it'll use that box as a box trace, and it'll make sure that the trees are at least that distance from each other so they're not overlapping. However, you can increase or decrease the trace used by a specific amount here to have a specific effect. So for example, for the foliage, by default is -50. That means that whatever bounce I have from my foliage, I'm actually going to reduce it by 50 units to try to pack those trees together. Because if you look at a tree, the bounce of the tree will include the leaves. But typically, you want the bounce to be slightly less because the collision is usually only in the trunk. So let's just to give you an idea, right? So let's make sure that we just make this 0, and we try to spawn our foliage. And everything spawned. We spawned 756 trees, and notice kind of the distance and the distribution of the trees. If I go ahead and remove this and say, actually, I want the trace padding to be -250. I want to reduce that padding, and I try to spawn foliage. Notice that now we have 1,200 trees that spawned. It's a lot more dense now. Notice that. Because what I've told the spawner is the actual bounds of the trees are whatever I specified minus 250. And you can play with those numbers, right? Minus 500 or minus 400. If I try to spawn the foliage, now we have 1,600 trees that are spawned, and we have way more density of the foliage. So that's pretty much it, right? This is how you use this. And you can obviously change these values for different things, like the entrance trace padding. This is when you spawn your entrances. If you want your entrances to be more separated, you can increase this value, or you want it more packed in, you can decrease it. Same thing for the central actors, for the props, for the foliage, and then the grass. Again, use the default values, but if you need to change the density, you can play around with these values as well. And finally, the debug details, and this is just a way of seeing the trace, right? So let's go ahead and spawn some trees here, and I'm going to change this number to okay, maybe not 25. Let's maybe make it 100. I want to spawn 100 trees, but for some reason the trees aren't spawning correctly, or I just want to know exactly what the tool is doing. I can come here and say I want to debug the foliage trace. I select this, and now if I try to spawn my trees, spawn foliage, you'll notice that now you can physically see all of the traces that the park is doing to place your trees. Simple as that, right? That's really all there is to it. And you may think, okay, this is not that useful. So it depends on what you are trying to do. So you can debug the path trace, for example. So if I wanted to see how the trace, how the pathways are generated, I can go ahead and click on my central actors and create pathways. And notice now that now I can see for every single segment how I'm doing the traces to make sure that each individual pathway is generated. So again, if you're curious to see how things work, you can use this debug. Or if you're having any issues, you use the debugs. That's pretty much it. Calculated bounds, this does really nothing. It's just to give you an idea of the actual size of the park in Unreal units. This is a scale, 500 by 500, that's just a scale, but the actual size, the calculated bounds are 16,500 by 16,250, roughly. This is just information. That really is all there is to it. Alright guys, and that is pretty much it. We went over all of the different settings here in general. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the different settings for the central actors. And we're going to go step by step, and we're going to go in the order as expected. Central actors, pathways, props, etc. Alright guys, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.